Hello, I'm David Breeden. I am the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis, and I have the pleasure of having with me today Susan Brower, who is the Minnesota State Demographer. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
I want to find out what a Minnesota State Demographer does, but first off, I want to think a little bit, because you're the person who knows about our aging population, and we were able to chat a little bit about that, and I know a lot of people have been hearing about that. So tell us about how the population is changing in Minnesota.
Well, here in Minnesota, like a lot of places, we are going to be experiencing and have begun to experience a sharp increase in our older adult population. So people who are ages 65 and above is just set to increase very, very rapidly from now until 2030. And this is important for us to understand because it will impact all kinds of areas of our lives.
I've heard it described as the pig in a python, the baby boom generation, as, you know, I'm at the end of that, but
Yeah.
we were so huge. And of course, our preceding generation, our parents were smaller because of the Depression, so people didn't have kids, and then suddenly all these kids started coming, and after the Second World War, big boom times, et cetera. And then we've kind of changed everything as we have gone through the population, right?
That's right. We've kind of come to understand what is normal as the age structure that we have now, where most of the people in the state are really between about 50 and mid-60s to late 60s. The largest cohort is in that age group.
Really? I'm the norm, huh?
You're the norm, especially, well, I won't speculate on your age, but
I'm the norm. Yes. And as being at the end of the baby boom generation, always, for me anyway, everything has always been ready. You know,
Yeah.
The schools were big enough by the time I got there. They'd already been expanded, so the universities had already expanded by the time I got to them. So everything has always been ready for me. How about the nursing home?
Well, they may be ready, by the time you may need them. Many people don't need them, of course, but that big baby boom generation, born between 46 and 64, so that has folks in their late 60s now, kind of moving closer to those ages that we would expect to be nursing home ages. So I'd say there's a fair chance that with respect to that, we would be ready for people who are in their 50s, who happen to be the largest cohort in their 50s. So sometimes people will ask, how come I'm not seeing what I expected to see? Because I've been hearing about aging for so long. How come I'm not seeing it yet? Well, it's really just recently that the baby boomers even started moving into the older ages. And really here in the state, most of our baby boomers are in their 50s. And so it will be a little bit of time until that pig in the python moves through a little bit more.
Okay, well, yeah, but it will happen because time passes.
That's
so
right.
25 years from now, when we look up, what are we going to see?
Well, what we're expecting to see going forward is a transition to a much older society, an older state, and it will stay that way. So, even though that image of the pig and the python kind of has some imagery associated with it that might suggest that it's a temporary thing, it really is a transition to a permanent state where we have many more older people relative to our younger populations.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we expect by 2020, for the first time, that we will have more older adults than school-age children. So that's coming up, in it'll feel like about 5 minutes, but it'll be in about 5 years. And that same age structure with more older people than school-age children is something that's going to remain into the foreseeable future. So we're really at a point right now where we're transitioning into whatever the new normal is going to be for us.
Okay. Well, I've had Gen X friends say, well, you baby boomers, you broke everything for us. I mean, when we came along, the schools were all broken down. When you came along, the jobs were no longer good, because you guys took all the benefits. And so, is this, are they just being mean to me?
I think you need to remind them how the baby boomers changed the world before they went into the workforce last time.
Oh, okay.
That's what I tell people. We don't know. We often talk about aging as if older adults in Minnesota, their lives are unidimensional and only relate to the physical care of their bodies. But I think if we think about the whole realm of possibilities that could open up in terms of time and effort and energy, once that big generation hits retirement age, that's a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of expertise that is just ready to make itself useful again.
Well, now, I mean, assuming that everyone's not going to work in a nursing home in the future, for the rest of that half is not going to work for the other half, what is the job and career situation going to look like in the future?
Well, it's hard to say specifically what industries are going to look like, because the jobs that will exist in 20 years, we don't even know what they are yet, right? Well, of course some will remain, but there will be a whole class of jobs that we couldn't even have predicted because they don't exist now. But we can make pretty well-educated guesses about just how many workers we'll have relative to the number of workers that we'll need. And when we do our labor force projections, the number of people who are available to work, we see a considerable slowing of the growth in our labor force going forward. So, that can have a lot of impacts. It can impact how quickly jobs can grow on the one hand. It can also impact opportunities for people. It may mean that there are more opportunities. But that it's also important to consider just how well aligned people's skills are with the jobs that we have. So it's a complex picture, but in general, we can say that we're going to see a slower growing labor force, and employers will need to consider how they can find new ways to recruit workers as the labor force slows.
So we baby boomers are all going to retire someday because the clock does tick. So if I'm 20 years old today, is the average, again, demographics, are we talking, is the average 20-year-old today going to be underemployed for the next 25 years, waiting for me to go? Or how does that really look, do you think?
It's hard to exactly put a time frame on it, but we're already seeing, the beginning part of that baby boom generation, which is still large. We're already seeing them exit the workforce, and it's at a time when our jobs have begun to pick up. The growth in jobs has begun to pick up. So right now, unemployment's really very, very low relative historically here in the state. And if we kind of layer on top of that the fact that many baby boomers will continue to leave, it's probably a pretty good bet that there will be job opportunities for our younger adults, more so than we've seen in the last decade.
Yeah. One of the things that I've seen as someone who reads a lot of resumes is that the people who are now around 30 have been underemployed for about 10 years now, roughly. If you graduated from college in 2008, chances are you didn't get the job of your dreams coming right out the gate there, right?
Right.
Yeah,
so right, the cohort of young people right now have had it really quite hard. Moving into the job market at the time of the recession and the slow recovery has been really hard for that group. I can say looking forward that I think it does look like there are more opportunities ahead as those baby boomers retire, and just paired with where our unemployment rate is right now.
Which is 4 point something, right? I won't make you write that in stone, but it's in that.
It was in the upper 3 points last time I looked. I believe it was for February. Yeah,
Really?
3.9 maybe in
Wow.
January or February of
That's
this year.
interesting. Now, I've read that. I mean, essentially, full employment is around 4% just because people are moving around,
There's always going to be some movement. Yeah.
So
Yep.
we're really at a saturation point in the state.
We're close. I mean, the other question then is, there are some different ways of looking at unemployment. The one that we tend to look at is the one that you and I are talking about. Other surveys gather information about people who are underemployed, meaning that they have part-time employment when they want full-time employment. So there may be a group there that still has yet to be brought into work life.
Okay.
But that's likely to happen as jobs continue to grow and as we continue to see these retirements. So, but you're right. We're really at a point that economists typically call full employment. But there is room.
Well, way to go, Minnesota. But how are we going to fill those jobs in the future? We know that the population is it going to start shrinking?
No, it'll continue to grow as far as our projections show, and we base our projections on what we've experienced in the recent history. So of course they're subject to other factors that could come in and alter what we've experienced recently. So we will continue to grow, just very slowly. We'll add this decade, between 2010 and 2020, about 8,000 people each year to the labor force. That's slow growth, because last decade it was closer to 25,000 people each year. And what that means is that we'll have to be sure that every single person that we have here in the state who wants to work and is able to work, that we can pair them with jobs that we have.
Right. And what about immigration?
So when we're making our projections, we do take into account immigration, but immigration is typically something that goes hand in hand with countries or states that are in our situation. So there have been many other countries that have made this transition before us. Italy, Japan, a number of European, Asian countries have made the transition to a slower growing population. And typically what happens, but not always, it often depends on policy, is that increased immigration goes hand in hand with an aging society with a slower growing labor force. Because you need to bring more people in to kind of bolster that growth and meet the demands of employers.
Okay, all right. And so one of the things we need to be looking at, I suppose, as a state is acculturating, getting people into the culture, and education so that people can learn the job skills that they need. And how's that? How's that look from the state, from the capital?
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one of my major concerns, is when we look at some of the gaps that we have in terms of educational attainment, educational achievement, and the gaps in employment. I mean, that rosy picture that we were just talking about for very low unemployment doesn't apply for many subpopulations,
Right.
for African American men in particular, for American Indians. So there's a number of racial groups for whom unemployment rates still are persistently high. And it's going to be even more important going forward that we just figure out how to bring in every person who wants to work, regardless of where they came from on the globe or what their racial, ethnic, cultural heritage is. We're going to have to figure this out in order to continue to grow economically as a state.
So education.
Yeah, I mean education, but maybe not in the form that we've seen it in the past.
Interesting. Interesting. And, well, we know that there are educational gaps as well. I mean that some groups don't finish high school, and that's going to be a problem as we go into a more and more technological society. Right?
That's right.
So.
And so my question is, how can employers help to bridge that gap? to help bring people in as quickly as possible into the labor force. And that's something that employers haven't really seen as their role. And they're beginning to. Some are beginning to, but up until this point, I think they've really looked at the educational system as kind of the institution through which you pass, and then when you're on the other side of it, you're a fully formed, ready to go worker or adult.
Right.
And I think, the employers that are able to kind of see what the implications of this aging trend are those who are going to see that they're going to need to be a little bit more creative about where they find new people.
Well, if I have a highly specialized requirement in, say, manufacturing,
Yep.
I mean, it's going to be in my interest to figure out a way to get people ready for that.
That's right.
And sounds like maybe some partnerships with the state might work well, and partnerships with education. I know that we're always talking about community college and maybe getting that more affordable for people, and it might be one direction. And
Yep.
so
Yeah, those are all parts of the discussion and some of the pilot projects that are going on now, but I think those we're likely to see more of in the coming years.
interesting.
Yeah.
So you don't feel hopeless about the demographic trends.
I don't, although I do think that it's the gaps in attainment and well-being that we've seen for decades here are really coming to a point now where there's really much more of an economic argument for how to solve these gaps. And so I think maybe this is the impetus that's needed to really be able to figure out how to bring more people into the skills that they need for the jobs that we have.
Well, we know that Canada, for example, part of their immigration policy has to do with skills.
Okay.
And getting into the country, and they're always looking for particular skills. I mean, one of the things that the recent oil boom would indicate, we kind of count on a mobile population, don't we? Because South Dakota certainly didn't have the population to do all of the oil business there, so people started moving in from other places. But if Wisconsin already has all the jobs anyone needs in Wisconsin, no one's coming here, are they? So I mean.
Yeah, and we're already starting to see some increased immigration from countries of high-skilled workers. So in particular, if you look at our population coming from India, Asian Indians, we've seen a huge influx in the last 10 years. And many of those, I think it's close to 85%, have a bachelor's degree or higher, so those are kind of our census numbers that indicate that some of that high-skilled migration is already happening here in the state as well.
So countries that are producing, India is well known for technology and also medicine. So we're probably going to go shopping as a state eventually, perhaps.
And they're growing.
To find, they're
growing.
Those places where populations are going up and getting younger, because I mean, many countries do have very young populations, right? So that maybe there's a worldwide balance that we're shooting for eventually, but that's going to take a very different way of thinking than we have nowadays.
That's right. Yeah.
So you go out and in your job and talk about that, and I hope try to talk to industry leaders and wake them up to this fact. What else do you do as the state demographer?
I do whatever it takes to get out kind of the message of what I think are the important demographic trends. A lot of it's talking to people. Big groups, little groups, but it's also a lot of data analysis. So it might, one day might be spent entirely at my computer analyzing data, and then going out and sharing kind of what I've learned. The topics that we cover in our center tend to be around labor force, like we've been talking about, education, birth rate, migration, those kinds of trends are kind of what we keep our eyes on most carefully. And then work with all kinds of different state agencies and local agencies to give them the data that they need to make good decisions and kind of have a heads up about what's coming.
So my office would call you and say, wait, I need to know about the birth rate in such and such a county.
That's
I
right.
mean, you keep up with
Yep.
where people are.
Yep, absolutely. So it may be school districts who want to know kind of what do we expect in our region of the state in terms of growth? What have birth rates been looking like? Do we need to build a new school, or are we kind of set with those facilities as we have them? So that kind of stuff. It can be
Mm-hmm.
it can be that. It can be people who are trying to think strategically about how to get Minnesota in a really good position relative to other states. So I might talk to kind of those strategic business leaders of nonprofits. It's a lot. It's a range of things. It's very interesting.
Well,
to me.
We'll get back to that. But so I mean, I know one of the problems is getting, for example, physicians to more rural areas.
Yeah.
So you're trying to keep an eye on the population patterns in more rural counties as well.
That's right. Even beyond physicians, many of our rural areas now are having a hard time finding young people to care in nursing homes, care for the elderly in nursing homes. So even to just find someone who may have a high school education, who kind of fits the age profile, who can do heavy lifting and strenuous work like that, they're still coming up. Really, it's a difficult search, I should say. It's really difficult for people in some areas of the state to find the workers they need in the location where they are.
What's the lowest population county? Do you know it off the top of your head?
Oh my goodness. I'm trying to think of it.
It's,
I don't think I know
it's
it.
not a test, but I mean,
there are some that are very small. There's Hennepin County kind of dwarfs many of the counties, even in the 7-county region. So
Right.
What's happening in Hennepin County doesn't always speak for the state, but it certainly influences the state trends that we see overall.
Right. Well, I mean, I come from rural southern Illinois, and in Illinois, of course, Chicago is where is where people go, and it's where people are, and it's where the economic engine of the state is, and then the rest of us are kind of left out, and then we do as I did, which is we drive away, and leave the county, and of course that's a brain drain on the more rural areas that just leads to more and more problems very often. I know the county I'm from has half the population now that it did at the beginning of the 20th century. So,
and it's kind of a double whammy when the young people move away like that, because then they have their children elsewhere in the metro areas or wherever they've moved to. So you have this very old population relative to kind of a younger group, and very few babies, very few relative to the size of the group. You tend to have very old populations in rural areas for that very reason.
And then you don't have a Cineplex, so you can't go to the movies, and so no one wants to live there, right? I mean, it's kind of a spiral.
It's been a long-term, many decades trend. However, there is a researcher at the U who's looked at a counter trend where people around their 30s end up moving back to their communities where they were raised. So it is a measurable trend that you can see, that people who were born in a small town in rural Minnesota move to the Twin Cities or one of our other metros in the region. And then you see at about age 30, around the time they have children, moving back. So they want to raise their children where they were raised, and they want the help of their parents, of course.
Okay, yeah, that makes and interestingly enough, though, I mean, it made sense to me at the time when the internet really just started taking off in the mid '90s. There was a lot of talk about telecommuting and that the internet would decentralize the population, and that really hasn't worked out yet.
I think you would be surprised the lack of high-speed internet that still exists in many of our rural counties. So it just hasn't reached, and that's a big push at the legislature this year, and it has been for the last 5 to 10 years to expand broadband access all around the state. I wonder that too. I just wonder how decentralized, how much of a change in our migration patterns we'll see when people truly can work from anywhere. Well, of course, not all jobs you can do that, but there's a fair share in our current day jobs picture that you can telecommute. But I think we're just not there yet.
We're not there yet in terms of the actual technology. So
yeah.
We got about 3 minutes left. I would love to know how anyone. I am innumerate, essentially, all right? I mean, I do not understand numbers. I throw statistics around only to scare people in talks, right, when I read something scary. But how does someone get involved and interested in statistics?
Well, I think I wasn't interested in statistics per se. I was interested in kind of what the lens of statistics could do to help someone help me understand a situation that looks very normal, very everyday. So when you start looking at statistics, from my opinion, and especially demographics, you start to see big patterns that are shaping those everyday experiences that we all have. So we just come to, experience our days and our families and our work lives as normal. And once we start understanding through a statistical lens, through a demographic lens, the large trends underlying that everyday activity, I just think it's a fascinating kind of window on the world that you don't get to see all the time.
Well, I know when statistics really began to be used, that people were frightened because of the idea of free will. I mean, that suddenly you could predict how many houses would burn down, and so you can start an insurance agency, and you know how many people are going to be murdered in the city of Paris. And I mean, does that ever scare you? that
Well, the statistics aren't that good. And I can't see a time when they would be. First, the data aren't that great. I mean, they could be, but it's just too expensive to have the kind of data that would really be able to predict things like you're talking about. So I think what we need is more of a balance between what we can see and know and understand firsthand, and then what we see and know and understand through statistics, and just kind of compare to see how much of a overlap there is. I'm always most convinced that the trend that I'm seeing in the data and the statistics is real when I can hear the stories of people who corroborate kind of what I'm seeing in the data. So interesting.
Well, crystal ball. We could be wrong, but. Is big data going to change things? I mean, we hear a lot about now in science, big data is helping with neurobiology and discovering how the brain works and things of that nature. Is that going to impact your job?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that people are paying a lot more attention to the power of data and the kind of hidden value that maybe we haven't taken full advantage of in the past. I still think that when you're examining, even in a big data framework, you still have to have a pretty good sense of the causes that are underlying the relationships that you can see. And many times in the big data projects, you can see correlations, see that things vary together in a patterned way, but you can't really make out what the cause is. And so I think we'll still need to keep working on that side of big data.
Well, okay. Well, it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you, Susan Brower. You are the Minnesota State Demographer, and I know so much more than I did when I started. So thank you so much.
Thanks
I'm
for
David
having me.
Breeden, and thank you so much for watching.